On this episode of the Carolina Sports Guy, we're talking about Tar Heels basketball. The top 12 all-time players of the 1980s for the North Carolina Tar Heels. First, before we get into today's content, folks, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. It doesn't cost anything. Hit that bell notification to be notified of other videos like you see today on the Tar Heels or other college sports in the Carolinas and the Carolina Panthers, Carolina Hurricanes, and Charlotte Hornets. Pound that like button. Please leave me some comments, folks. I'll get back to you. All right, folks, I kind of did an earlier video on the Tar Heels. I think I did the Sweet 16, the best players of the 70s for the Tar Heels. I kind of wanted to narrow it down a little bit more. The 70s were, were a good decade for the Tar Heels. You know, they were involved in the Final Four a few years. Closest they came was 77 when they lost the championship to Marquette. And in the 80s, they'd break through. You know, they made it to a couple Final Fours. In 81, they lost to Indiāna in the championship. And in 82, they're going to win the championship over Georgetown. And they had some really, really good teams. 83, 84 teams were outstanding teams because of beset by injuries. They didn't make it to the Final Four, were upset. But they had some very good teams in those years. So I said, let me just kind of narrow it down to the top 12 players. And my ranking may be different. This is where if you're a Tar Heel fan in basketball, you might look at this and say, well, I wouldn't rank that guy that high. Or I wouldn't have that guy in the top 12. Or you didn't put this guy on the list. And that's the beautiful thing about these rankings. Because sometimes you can go back and watch old games, pull up statistics and highlights. And the older you get, your memory sometimes, you'll forget a certain player. It does happen. So as I do this list, bear in mind, I'm going to have three guys I'm going to talk about, and they just barely touched in the 80s. They were a product of the 70s on the 70s team. I haven't done one on the 90s yet, so I'm sure this one player I'm going to talk about real quick here did make it on the 90s team. And I had a couple of honorable mentions, and it's basically the honorable mentions were guys who just weren't quite good enough to make the top 12. And one of them really just got the most of his attention. His 4 years, he got half of them in the 90s where he was predominantly a better player as he got older. All right, so first, dealing with three guys who didn't make the list. Rich Yonakor. Rich Yonakor mainly did his damage in the 70s. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Yonakor was on that top 16 list of the Tar Heels, maybe around 14 or 15 in the 70s. But he did play 1 year in the 80s, and he would be drafted, and he played 1 year for the San Antonio Spurs. Another one, Mike O'Korn. Mike O'Korn did most of his damage in the 80s. 3 years in the 70s. 3 years in the 70s for the Heels. And he had his most productive year, the 1 year he had in 1979-1980 campaign. But just with the 1 year, I didn't have him on this list, and he would go on and be drafted by the New Jersey Nets and play for a little while in the NBA. The other player that I had that didn't make the honorable mention list was a product of the 90s, and that's now head coach Hubert Davis. His first career was 1989-1990, 1988-1989. So basically, the last year, the 88-89 year for the Heels, because 89-90, we kind of put that in the 90s, was Hubert Davis' freshman year. And his freshman year, he only averaged 3.3 points. So I believe if I do a list on the 90s, Hubert Davis is going to crack the top 10, top 12, whatever. But I just wanted to briefly mention him because he's kind of closing out the 80s. And, you know, he's going to go on and be drafted by the New York Knicks. And I know he played for Dallas as well. Now, two honorable mentions I'll have on this list. The first one I'll talk about is Rick Fox. Rick Fox spent 2 years playing for the Tar Heels in the 80s, 2 years in the 90s. His most productive years, of course, as he got older, were in the 90s for the Tar Heels. And he had a magical run, I want to say, in the 1991 year when they made the Sweet 16 for the Tar Heels as they advanced on in the tournament. But the 2 years in the 80s, Rick Fox was very instrumental. He came in low-key, developed, and I wanted to mention him, and he'd go on and be drafted and play for the Boston Celtics. And I believe he won an NBA championship playing for the Lakers. So the last honorable mention I'll have played all his years in the 80s for the Tar Heels. And we're basically going back to looking at 1980, looking at 81, 82, and the 1983 year, and that's Matt Doherty. Matt Doherty, started the last year or two for the Heels. He wasn't a leading scorer. He was a very solid starter. His first couple of years, he was just kind of a role player coming off the bench. And he would be drafted by Cleveland. Never really got an NBA game, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out there because he was drafted basically because he was such a solid role player for a blue blood team like the Tar Heels, and that was Matt Doherty. All right, now we're going to get into the top 12 players for the Tar Heels. Number 12, Jimmy Black. And I got Jimmy Black playing, I know he played like the 79, 80 year, 80, 81, 81, 82. And Jimmy Black really wasn't a big contributor with points, but he was an awesome point guard. And I don't believe the Tar Heels would have won the 82 championship over Georgetown if it wasn't for the point guard play of Jimmy Black. Very solid. He would be drafted by New Jersey. I don't think he had a long NBA career, but he is number 12 on this list because of his contributions as a point guard. Number 11. And number 11 on the list also made the list, I believe, in the 70s. But he got 2 years in, or I really should say 1 year. He got the 79-80, but he got the 80-81 year was his final year. If it wasn't for Al Wood, though, the Tar Heels would have not made it to the 1981 championship game where they lost to Indiana. He was such a huge contributor, I had to put him, even though he did most of his damage in the 70s, I had to put Al Wood on this list because of how well he did this 80-81 year, and he would be drafted by Atlanta and go on and play for some other teams in the NBA. All right, now we get to the top 10. Number 10 was a big role player. He came for the Tar Heels from the state of California. He wasn't someone right away you thought was going to be a great player. He was a role player. But as he made his career out and he graduated or finished for the Tar Heels, his main years were 87, 88, and 89, and Scott Williams. And by the time Scott Williams finished his career for the Tar Heels, he would go on, play a low-key role for the Chicago Bulls that made some championship runs, and he would be a contributing force for them. Scott Williams was a hell of a player for the Tar Heels when he was here, and he's the example of a guy, especially we'll get into like later on years with guys like Danny Green, guys who were very prominent role players that carved out a niche in the NBA, but just came in kind of low fanfare and would build up from there. Now, a lot of people look at number 9 and think Scott Williams should be past number 9. I just kind of look at the 4-year career this guy had in 84, 85, 86, and 87. That's Dave Popson. And a lot of people remember Scott Williams because of his NBA career more than Dave Popson. But Popson was a hell of a contributor for the Tar Heels. And yeah, he only started out averaging like 2 points a game as a freshman. But by the time he finished, he was a solid starter in 87. And he would be drafted by Detroit. I don't think he played with Detroit, but mainly did his damage with the Los Angeles Clippers. And that's Dave Popson. Number 8. Number 8 came in the same time Dave Popson. I don't think you can make the argument that Scott Williams would be above him, but Joe Wolf. And Joe Wolf's older brother played for the Tar Heels, Jeff Wolf. Jeff Wolf played some in the late 70s. I think got involved in like 1980, 81, but Jeff Wolf. But this is Joe Wolf. Joe Wolf, the younger brother, was a better player. And like I said, he played 84, 85, 86, 87. What made him above Popson, all 4 years they played together, Joe Wolf played more minutes, played more games, scored more points. And I definitely think he's a solid number 8 player on this list. Number 7, Jeff Lebo. Jeff Lebo was a solid guard. I believe he came out of the state of Pennsylvania, played sparingly in the 86 his freshman year, got better in 87, and 88 and 89 had remarkable years. Was a true point guard, great point guard for the Heels. Just a solid player, had an illustrious career, and he is number 7 on the list. And when he would go on and have a small cup of coffee in the NBA, played with San Antonio. Now we're starting to get to guys that really made a difference for the Heels. Number 6, J.R. Reid. Had a 3-year career before he went pro. And that would be the 87 year as a freshman, had a remarkable year. 88, his numbers rose. That was the best year he had. I think he averaged 18 points a game. Tar Heels very well with him. And then 89. His average dropped a little, but I think teams just played him better, and he was asked to do more. He would be drafted by the Charlotte Hornets, and he'd go and play for some other teams. But J.R. Reid, great player out of Kentsville High School in Virginia Beach, Virginia, but just an all-around great player for the Tar Heels. J.R. Reid at number 6. Now the top 5 truly are great Tar Heels. Number 5, Kenny Smith, point guard from New York. Kenny Smith played at 84, 85, 86, and 87. And, he only averaged between 12 and 13 points a game. But let me tell you something. His freshman year in 84, when they had Jordan on this team, Perkins was on this team, they were number 1 in the country. I did not see them getting beat. And I believe that right before the tournament, or was right in the tournament, he went up for a dunk or a layup, had a hard foul. I'm trying to remember the team. It was a ratty-ass, no-good team, small school, and it escaped me now. Tar Heels won the game, but Kenny Smith broke his wrist. Tar Heels weren't the same after that. I believe this 84 team was just as good as the 82 team, and I believe this 84 team, if Kenny Smith doesn't get hurt, break his wrist, it might not have happened, but I pretty much would bet my money that the Tar Heels would have won the 84 championship that year, because once Kenny Smith went down, that was it for him. He was drafted by Sacramento in the NBA. He played a majority of his years at his peak for the Houston Rockets. Kenny Smith was an outstanding player. And if some of y'all don't remember Kenny Smith, maybe you know him now because he's a TV analyst for TNT for the NBA now. Number 4. Number 4 could have went as high as number 2, folks. But I feel that this center coming out of Western North Carolina, Brad Dougherty, and not to be confused with Matt Dougherty, this is Brad Dougherty. Brad Dougherty played 1983, 84, 85, and 86, all 4 years. He averaged like 14 points a game, but his last year he averaged 20 points a game. He slowly started like 9, 10 points a game range, 13 points, 16 points, 20 by the time he graduated. He was the number 1 overall draft pick in the 86 draft by the Cleveland Cavaliers, played a significant role, played 10 years there, had his number retired. He was an awesome player for the Tar Heels. Good big man. I compare him really to a poor man's Tim Duncan. I know Tar Heel fans hate to hear that, but but Dougherty was awesome. Number 3, here's where some people might not like number 3. Number 3 actually could have been number 4. Number 3 had a 3-year NBA career. His numbers weren't that high. He was an impressive player. And that's James Worthy, forward, from Gastonia, North Carolina. He was on the 1979-80 team, so he comes right in the 80s. Didn't have a lot of points. The 81 team, he was a remarkable player. I think he averaged about 13, 14 points a game. And by the time we get to his junior year, the 81-82 team, probably the best player we had on the team. We won a national championship over Georgetown, and he averaged like over 15 points a game. His average was between 14 and 15 points a game, but only stayed 3 years. After his junior year and he won a championship in 82, he declared himself pro. He was the number 1 overall draft pick of the LA Lakers. Stupid Cleveland Cavaliers trading draft picks away back in the day for money. But, and Worthy wins championships for the Lakers with Magic Johnson and Kareem. He was an awesome NBA player. I've got him number 3 on the list. And some people are going to look at me and shake their head who I got at number 2. I put number 2 because he had a higher average. He played 1 more year than Worthy, and that's why I'm giving him the nod. If you compared them head-to-head, Worthy was probably better, but we're looking at the greatest Tar Heels of all time. And this next guy was on that 84 team where Worthy wasn't, that really, should have won it all. And that's Sam Perkins. Sam Perkins, I believe, out of New York. He played on the 81 team that lost as a freshman, that lost the championship game to Indiāna. He was a sophomore on the 82 team, a starter. The year they beat Georgetown, he played on a prominent 83 team, and the 84 team that should have won it all, it was ranked number 1. And he was drafted by Dallas, but went on to have a long career, played for many other teams. But he averaged 17.6 a game. in the 4 years because he played one more year and he had a higher career average. That's why I'm giving Perkins a nod over Worthy. And the number one player all time in the 1980s, make no mistake about it, folks, he only played 3 years there. He only had an 18-point average per game, but his last 2 years he averaged 20 in his sophomore and junior year. But of his freshman year, it was like 12, 13 points. But he went pro after his junior year, but he hit the championship, the one in 82. Had us number one if we wouldn't have lost Kenny Smith that year in 84. And that's none other than the great Michael Jordan. He will go down as the greatest player in Tar Heel basketball history. And like I said, even though he only played 3 years, he would come out after his junior year. And if you got a question between him and Perkins, he was a year behind Perkins. Perkins was a senior, graduated in 84. Jordan was as a junior. They both come out. Well, Perkins, I believe, went number 4, number 5 to Dallas. Number 3 to Chicago was Michael Jordan. Probably they did the draft over again. I guarantee you, Houston probably would have taken number 1. But the real shame is where Portland took Sam Bowie at number 2 because they could have used Jordan even though they had Clyde Drexler. So, folks, what do you think of today's video? Who would you rank as the top 5 greatest or top 12 like I did greatest Tar Heels of the 80s? Would you switch anybody around? Leave me some comments. Hit the bell notification to be notified of future videos like these. By all means, pound that like button and subscribe, folks. It doesn't cost anything. And we'll see you on another episode of the Carolina Sports.